interview for The Wire. Is India's stand on Ukraine contradictory and confusing, and even at times hypocritical? That's the key issue I shall raise today with the former Minister of External Affairs and former Under-Secretary General of the United Nations, Congress MP Shashi Tharoor. Shashi Tharoor, let me start with a general question before I come to specific issues. There is a view that India's stand on the Ukraine crisis is contradictory and confusing, and even at times hypocritical. Would you agree or would you disagree?
I'd partly agree. First of all, I think the confusions began at the very beginning, the day after the invasion, the day of the invasion, February 24th last year, when India took a surprisingly mealy-mouthed stand at the United Nations. It then kept recalibrating its language. So having first spoken at the UN, not even using the word invasion and uttering lots of bromides, and talking about both sides negotiating for peace, which obviously was absurd when one side is attacking and the other side is defending itself. After doing all that, they began to finally articulate some of the time-worn principles of Indian diplomacy that they had neglected to mention in their first few speeches. Things like the inviolability of sovereignty, the sanctity of borders, the need to avoid settling disputes through the use of force. That kind of language, which is the kind of stuff India had come up with for 70 years before, but which somehow it had not done in the case of this particular conflict. But it has nonetheless never condemned Russia by name, never used the word invasion. In fact, it has even not used the word war. But then, having started off that way and having tried to maintain acceptable relationships with both countries, Russia and Ukraine, sending humanitarian aid to Ukraine, even while refusing to condemn its aggressors, India then started making noises which were welcome to some of us. As you know, I was a critic of the Indian government stand at the beginning, but I was welcoming it when in September, Prime Minister Modi announced in front of Mr. Putin that this is not an era of war. That sounded like a very clear statement of disapproval. Again, he didn't actually say that Russia had engaged in an unprovoked war, but he did say it's not an era of war. In other words, one needs to end it. But he never did criticize the country that had started the war. Then we have the somewhat surprising development during the recent G7 meeting.
Let me pause you there, because let's remind the audience of that development before you talk about it. I think that is a key issue in our conversation. In Japan, at that G7 meeting, the Prime Minister said, and I'm quoting him, "It is necessary that all countries respect the UN Charter, international law, and the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all countries." And then he added, "Raise your voice together against unilateral attempts to change the status quo." Now, no one would deny that is clearly the perfect thing to say. But the country that's violated the UN Charter, as well as the sovereignty and integrity of a fellow UN member, is Russia. And the Prime Minister refused to name Russia. And secondly, the Prime Minister called upon everyone to raise their voice. But the country that's silent and refusing to raise its voice is India. Isn't this hypocrisy?
Well, I mean, you're quite right. And that's precisely what's interesting. It sounded in one way as if that India was moving beyond its refusal to point a finger at the invader by actually, essentially, implicitly at any rate, accusing it of all these transgressions. But then at the same time, there was no further follow-up to that. There was no indication of any initiative to say that, Russia has unilaterally tried to change the status quo, and India joins the chorus of those countries that doesn't want that to happen. What's interesting about all of this is also in the background, the G20 going on, because the G20 in Indonesia last year was able to achieve consensus on a resolution and on a summit declaration that actually did put the Russians on the spot by name. But in all of the meetings that India has presided over, including the foreign ministers meeting and the finance ministers meeting, they could not bring the sides to an agreement, and Russia and China essentially refused to agree to any language on Ukraine. The West refused to compromise on their language on Ukraine, and as a result, there was no agreed declaration at both of those events. Now, India diplomatically cannot afford a summit declaration that again shows a complete breakdown of relationships amongst the G20, because that would then be interpreted diplomatically as a failure. And I can't help thinking that what Mr. Modi said of the G7 was a step towards satisfying the West. He might have been floating a trial balloon saying, how about this kind of language? Would this be good enough for you to accept if we can persuade the Russians and Chinese to sign on to this come the September summit in India? I don't know. I've not
Let me question that. Let me question that, because
let me just finish the thought. In other words, what seems to us as hypocrisy might be, and that's why I said I only partially endorse your question, it might be a tentative step towards identifying the basis of a compromise at the G20 summit. And because we don't know what's lying behind Mr. Modi's mind in saying this, that's, to my mind, a more convincing explanation than just saying that India keeps saying things it doesn't mean and is therefore hypocritical.
Well, hang on a second. Let me interrupt you there. Okay. How can you say, as Mr. Modi said, that it's necessary that all countries respect the UN Charter, international law, and the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all countries, and yet not name the country that's blatantly not doing that? How can you say it's important we should all raise our voice, and yet be the one country that doesn't raise a voice? I mean, if that is a sort of solution that Mr. Modi is floating to the rest of the G7 or the G20, he's actually not going to succeed if he doesn't name the country but only hint at it. It doesn't serve any purpose.
This is an absolutely fair point you made. It's similar to what I've been saying myself in Parliament and elsewhere, that we cannot continually avoid pointing to the fact that there is an invasion that's gone on. One side has invaded the other. It's bromides to talk in terms of both sides talking peace, when actually one side is the sole attacker. But the fact still is that India has so far got away with this, Karan.
But we'll come to that in a moment's time. Let me first continue let's focus on India's position. We'll then come to getting away with it. Let's not collapse everything together. Let me bring up what the Prime Minister said to Mr. Zelensky when he met the Ukrainian president in Japan. To Mr. Zelensky, the Prime Minister said that India sees the Ukraine crisis as a matter of humanity and of human values. Now, clearly, once again, that is the right thing to say. But isn't it contradictory not to name the country that's breached humanity and breached human values by invading Ukraine? And clearly, failing to name that country is not going to please President Zelensky. If anything, it'll irritate him.
I couldn't agree with you more. As I said, this is why I've been racking my brains to figure out why the Prime Minister would have done this. He's not unscripted, as you know. He doesn't ad-lib these things. This has been carefully prepared for him by the mandarins in the Foreign Ministry and is part of a very conscious initiative. The only rational explanation, if I put myself in the shoes of those people in South Block who must have prepared this for him, would be to say, listen, to the Western side, we are trying to find the formula that you can live with. And to the Russian side, we're inching closer to a condemnation.
Mr. Tharoor, I'm not asking you to second guess why the Prime Minister is saying this. You don't know why he's saying it. You're simply concocting explanations to make his saying it sound rational. Let's not do that. Because more importantly, I'd rather you comment on what he said rather than find justification for why he said it, which is clearly a concoction.
Karan, if there is a justification ever, it can only be this one. If there isn't, if it is not an attempt to salvage the G20 summit, then indeed you are right that it is a statement of arrant hypocrisy, because essentially you are saying, for example, that the G7 and other countries connected to it should resist any unilateral attempts to change the status quo. After all, the Russians have unilaterally changed the status quo. Perhaps Mr. Modi had China in mind, which has unilaterally changed the status quo on our borders. But in the context, I think it's very clear that anything he said would be seen as applying to both China and Russia.
Let's for a moment focus on what Mr. Modi said to Mr. Putin in Uzbekistan in September. It's captured the imagination of the world, and leaders, whether from France or Britain, keep repeating it. His words were, this is not an era of war. No. And as I said, it clearly hit the right note. But again, isn't it contradictory that although this is not an era of war, India is unable to criticize the country that started the war.
We're even unable to call it a war, Karan. You won't
Which
find
makes it worse.
You won't find a statement by India which refers to war or invasion. And in fact, you won't find, if I'm reasonably certain that you will not find a statement in which Russia is called out by name. So essentially, we have been trying to dance very delicately on this particular tightrope of articulating principles which we have always stood by, without actually pointing the finger at the country that has violated those principles. That's been consistent for the last year and a few months since the war began, a year and 3 months. This has consistently been India's approach. Now, today, or rather at the G7 a few days ago, we took an incremental step beyond that by actually implying that a change in the status quo by any country, unilaterally means one country taking that action, needs to be spoken out against. Now, that, to my mind, is one step beyond anything we've done for the last year.
No, it's not. Even in our UN statements, we have said we stand by the UN Charter, we defend the sovereignty, integrity of all nations. These are, as you call them, bromides we voiced before, some a year ago. But on every occasion, as you put it, we've enunciated
unilateral
the
status quo change is a new step forward. That's
no. We made those points at the UN in our statements as well. There's no doubt about it. But even then and now, we refuse to name the transgressor. And this is where, in September, a measure of confusion creeps in to the contradiction. Because the truth is that when the Prime Minister says that this is not an era of war, neither the Prime Minister nor Mr. Jaishankar call what's happening in Ukraine a war. They adroitly circumvent doing so. So if in your eyes, and this is the important contradiction and confusion, if in your eyes there's no war happening, then what is the significance of saying this is not an era of war? It's a meaningless statement unless you acknowledge there is a war happening. Therefore, there is either confusion. Therefore, there is either confusion or worse. India is obliquely and indirectly saying what it cannot say upfront and honestly.
Well, what's interesting is it got worse in October last year when the Prime Minister spoke to Mr. Zelensky on the phone and officially conveyed India's view that there cannot be a military solution to the problem. Now, given that a military problem has been imposed upon Ukraine, it's very unclear what we mean by telling Ukraine there can't be a military solution. How do you defend yourself against an invasion without using arms? So it's a very strange. India keeps wanting to talk about peace and settling matters without recourse to military action. But the fact is, the only answer to military action has to be military action. Otherwise, the only alternative is surrender. And surely we're not advocating to Ukraine that it surrenders. So there is definitely, you're quite right, a whole series of inconsistencies in our statements and our policies. And what we've never done is to say there's an invasion going on, Russia started it, and it must stop it because this is not an era of war and because a unilateral change to the agreed status quo is not acceptable. Now, this kind of position we've never taken. And I must say, we didn't take it during Crimea in 2014, but people felt that Crimea was a very special case, that it was Ukrainian almost by accident. But this is Ukraine, good and proper, that Russia has invaded, is bombarding regularly, and Ukrainians being killed every day. And at a time when the UN Charter is unambiguous about who's right and who's wrong on this, India's statements do look confusing. And its most recent statement is either an attempt to somehow move the goalpost with the G20 in mind, or it's arrant hypocrisy. But I can't say that I will definitively pronounce that it's one when it might be the other.
So if I sum up what you said correctly, I'm only repeating it because I think the audience would like to be clear. You said there's a whole series of inconsistencies in Indian policy. You said India's position is often confusing, often arrant hypocrisy.
As I say, the last statements at the G7 are either hypocritical or an extremely clever maneuver to try and move the goalpost towards an agreed declaration, towards language that would be acceptable to both sides at the G20. I mean, that honestly is the only good explanation possible. I don't want to deny the government the benefit of the doubt that some Mandarin has thought through the next.
This is your assumption. I keep pointing it out to the audience. This is your assumption.
But that's what commentators do, Karan. We assume. I certainly don't have any.
Well, you're not just a commentator. You're also an opposition personality, and you're also an analyst. But what you're doing is try and find merit and justification for the prime minister, and that is, I'm saying, not your job to do. But let me put something else to you. Let's develop a little what you correctly pointed out. The message given in October to President Zelensky when the prime minister said there can be no military solution. That either implies that President Putin will withdraw of his own, which is unimaginable, or President Zelensky should grit his teeth and accept the outcome and he's lost a certain amount of land. If a similar message was given by the world to India in the event that the Chinese had occupied Indian territory, and many people believe that the Chinese have already done so in Ladakh, that message would be extremely offensive to our ears, wouldn't it?
Well, except that our own prime minister claims that we haven't lost any territory. And I mean, it's one of these very peculiar things where there's considerable amount of evidence, including in a document by a senior police officer near the border, that we have lost access to 26 out of 65 points that we used to patrol, as indeed did the Chinese. Both sides used to patrol till April of 2020. Suddenly we've lost access to everything because the Chinese have gone and parked themselves there. How on earth can we now say publicly that the Chinese haven't occupied any territory? And having said that, why should we feel sorry if the rest of the world tells us to live with what we've lost? Because that's ultimately what this government seems to be acquiescing in. So that's a different issue, but it's not one that redounds in any way to the government's credit.
What about the point you raised? Why is India getting away with what you call inconsistency, confusing positions, contradictory positions, and positions that seem, unless you can supply a justification of your own, arrant hypocrisy? Why are we getting away with it? Is it because this is not apparent to the West, which supports Ukraine, or is it because, for strategic reasons, they're deliberately turning a blind eye and deaf ear?
I think there are two major reasons, and there may be a few minor ones we can't speculate about. But the two major reasons are, first, that I think in the bigger picture of what is emerging as a very clear pattern of confrontation between the US and China, that India is a country they would like to see on the US's side, and they don't want to condemn us or sanction us or punish us in any way for supporting Russia, because that would drive us into the arms of a new Russia-China axis, rather than in the side of resistance to China, which is where national interest dictates we should be, and which is where the West would like us to be. So that's the big strategic picture. They're very anxious not to cause too much offense to India. But the second reason, I think, frankly, and this is where the cynicism comes in, the West isn't doing too badly out of India, managing to keep links open with Russia and importing an awful lot of oil and gas from Russia. Because what's happening is we are refining the stuff in India and then selling it again to the very Western countries that have sanctioned Russia. The US and the UK, notably, are major purchasers of refined oil from India. Once it's refined in India, it becomes Indian oil and not Russian oil. But since we are taking 30% of Russia's oil exports, it's pretty clear that a lot of that is coming from Russia too. And the West is only too happy to turn a blind eye to it, because under the guise of purchasing India's oil, they're able to address some of their other shortages in terms of refined oil products. So there is a certain cynicism going on as well. I might add that that cynicism is rampant. Ukraine itself is allowing Russian gas to be transported through its territory for a fee. And this is while the Russians are busy bombing them. The Russians, of course, are careful not to bomb the pipelines transporting Russian gas to Europe. But it's going through Ukraine right now. And people don't realize how incredibly complicated this mess is for everyone. And I think it becomes difficult for countries to take a holier-than-thou attitude towards India, when India rightly says, look, we are a developing country. We have people who need energy. We can barely afford the prices that the international markets are imposing upon us. We will get energy where we can find it. So we've gone up from being a purchaser, I think, of about 1% of Russia's exports to about 30%, because all the others have sanctioned Russia. And now we are a significant buyer. Mind you, the Russians may not continue this indefinitely, because they complain they're stuck with a whole lot of rupees they don't know what to do with. But that's a different issue. All I'm saying is there is hypocrisy everywhere on this issue, on the issue of oil purchases. And so we are seeing some hypocrisy from the West as well in turning a blind eye to our apparent sort of bypassing of sanctions to trade with Russia.
Let me touch on another sort of hypocrisy, and this time it's a hypocrisy that actually is to do with your own party. You're one of the few MPs who's raised these concerns in Parliament. You raised them in interviews. You did so with me in February, immediately after the G20 finance ministers meeting. Your party has never had a word to say about this subject whatsoever. Over 15 months, it's silent. You've spoken today about serious inconsistencies, a confusing position, a contradictory position, one that even looks at times as if it's arrant hypocrisy. None of these things have been said by your party. Why is your party quiet?
To be honest, I don't know, because there is a foreign affairs cell of the party, and presumably that cell, of which I'm not a member, would have advised the Congress president as to what to say or what not to say. It's also entirely conceivable that the party could take the view that, listen, we try not to make foreign policy a political issue. First of all, we've got enough domestic issues to make a policy of, and besides, the Congress has always believed.
Hang on a second. You never hesitate to raise China. You've made China a huge foreign policy issue. Rahul Gandhi doesn't stop talking about China.
Well, rightly so, in my view. I think the Chinese.
So why not Ukraine?
Is an absolute embarrassment.
But why not Ukraine?
Perhaps my colleagues, or the senior colleagues in the Congress who make these decisions, prefer to see things sort of the Mandarin's way rather than my way on this particular issue. I mean, my larger concern.
Is there an attachment to the Soviet Union that goes back historically to Mrs. Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru that makes them reluctant to be critical of Moscow?
It could be. I mean, my point, by the way, which is a larger concern, is that a Russia that is increasingly dependent on China, thanks to sanctions and the Chinese becoming their principal market, as well as the principal source of supplies of essential goods that are otherwise sanctioned. Given that the Russia that's that dependent on China, how useful is Russia to us? It's no longer the old Russia that we could count upon as a reliable supporter geopolitically, geostrategically, and in terms of military supplies, all of which I think Russia's capacities have been eroded, and at a time when its own policies are going to require Chinese blessings. They're not likely to antagonize China.
These are good reasons. These are very good reasons for the Congress party finding its voice and articulating its position. Russia's importance is diminishing. Fear or apprehension of criticizing Russia is also therefore down. You can now be honest. But at a moment when you can afford to be honest, Congress is silent instead.
Well, I'll certainly convey these thoughts to people who are in a position to do something about this. I think, frankly, not every foreign policy issue seems to attract the kind of interest you and I have showed in it here in our domestic political space. In all fairness, no political party, not just the Congress, has said a word about this. They've left this field completely to the government of the day. And you know, that's not uncommon on many foreign policy matters. Though I think you're right. If we can make an issue of China, we could very well start at least asking questions about Russia too.
Finally, apart from an odd voice, the media by and large has not only failed to point out what you call inconsistencies, confusion, contradiction, and even arrant hypocrisy, it's gone worse. The media often applauds India's position on Ukraine. The media often claims that India is in a perfect position, perhaps as a sort of Vishwaguru, to even mediate. Quite whether we'd be acceptable as mediators to President Zelensky is another matter altogether. How do you respond to the media's failure to articulate concerns about India's position?
Well, I think the media has essentially bought into the government's line that what we are doing is the best thing in India's national interest. We are not antagonizing Russia, and as a result, we're getting cheap oil and gas. And at the same time, we can afford to cock a snook at the West because they need us badly enough not to turn against us. And that kind of combination of statements, what we described earlier as getting away with it, is something that the media is also, I think, applauding. I mean, you're right, I don't see any dissenting voices in the media about this. And indeed, many may turn around and say that the position you and I are taking is excessively precious or excessively wedded to principle and international law in an era in which there is hypocrisy and cynicism everywhere else. Why shouldn't we play that game too? Chanakya Niti is the flavor of the era, and they might think this is a very clever way of squaring that particular circle. So,
my last question, I'm taking you now back to your days as Under Secretary General of the United Nations.
Right.
India is extremely keen on a permanent position in the Security Council. But if at a moment like this, we're unable to speak up and defend the Charter and identify those that are blatantly and violently breaking the Charter, do we qualify for membership? And secondly, our relationship with the West is embedded in what the West calls, we call shared values. Those are shared democratic values. But once again, if a democracy is being invaded by Russia and we don't speak out in defense, where are those shared values? So on both counts, are we undermining ourselves? We may be gaining strategically in the short term. We're certainly gaining in terms of getting cheaper oil and then selling it at a profit. But in the long term, are we undermining our position and standing?
Well, no, I think our standing and our claim, the basis for our claim for a permanent seat, has to do with our size, our contributions to international peace and security, and so on, all of which I think are incontrovertible arguments. If there ever is to be any reform of the Council, we'd have to be on it. But having said that, it does put us in an invidious position that we were on the Council. What would we have done had we been on the Council at this time? Would we have abstained, as we did during the few months when we were a non-permanent member? Would we have tried again to sort of issue sort of somewhat mealy-mouthed explanations of vote and stay away from taking any concrete decision? And if we don't want to take such decisions and take such stands, what are we going to be using that seat for, other than as a recognition of our standing in the world? When we're not prepared to take any strong positions? It's a good question you've asked, and I think that's a question Indians need to ask ourselves. Do we really want a permanent seat if half the time we want to duck taking a stand on issues that permanent members are permanently called upon to take?
In other words, we want to be recognized as a power, but we lack the guts and the courage to behave like a power.
Well, those are your words, Karan. I wouldn't say that because I'm still in politics and I don't want to be in a position where they come back to haunt me. But your point is well taken.
And you're not disagreeing with it.
Guts,
smiling.
These are emotional.
Smiling instead. I'll settle for that engaging smile. Shashi Tharoor, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Karan.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch The Interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.